this occasion now to get us started officially and to begin our conversation today. My name is Katie Nathaniel, and I'll just very briefly say hello and welcome. I'm a senior lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, and also a member of the Exeter Decolonizing Network, as well as the European Center for Palestine Studies, who all came together to collaborate on this series over the last 2 years. Today, we're thrilled to welcome our two esteemed guests, our speakers, our teachers. And first, I'm going to pass over to Professor Gareth Stansfield, who is our dean, and we'll say a few more words before we launch into the conversation. So Gareth, I'll send it to you.
Thank you very much, Katie. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this event today. As Katie said, my name is Gareth Stansfield. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Executive Dean of the College of Social Sciences and International Studies, which is proudly home to the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, where I'm also a professor of Middle East politics and have the great pleasure of working with Katie and Ilan in that setting. Our Global Conversation series has been running since January 2021, and our guests have included Angela Davis, Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, Paul Gilroy, Elias Khoury, and Mustafa Barghouti. We have begun with the question of Palestine to unfold some of the most pressing issues of our times and issues that also apply and should be unpacked and understood in other areas of the world as well. The series diagnoses power and names violence, drawing attention to the devastating effects on local and global scales. But it also trains our focus on how people resist, how they maneuver, imagine, and organize. This is very much a future project which supports movements for justice, liberation, and self-determination. Today, we welcome Professors Gayatri, Charavorty, Spivak, and Professor Ilan Pappe, scholars and activists who have profoundly changed how we think and talk about violence and what we do to confront it. It is really a huge honor to host you in our virtual setting from the University of Exeter today, Professor Spivak. And of course, it's always a great pleasure to have Ilan host these events and see where the conversations take us. We're ever so proud of our Decolonizing Network in the university and of our Center for Palestine Studies for developing this initiative and making it such an important, high profile and really insightful, innovative series of events that really have challenged the way the university considers these questions and also opens up the debate for our academics, whether the professoriate, lecturers or students, to really engage with these massive questions of global importance. I'm going to hand back over to Katie, I think, but I hope you have a fantastic discussion. And we very much look forward to welcoming you in Exeter in person as soon as we can, Professor Spivak.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually going to hand over to our chairs for the day. Hashem and Nandini, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie. So just by way of introduction, my name is Hashem Abu Sham'a. I am a doctoral candidate in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. My work interrogates the relationship between settler colonialism and dispossession on arts in post-Oslo Palestine, and I'm really honored to be here. Just before we start, we would like to thank the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies, the European Center for Palestine Studies, and the Exeter Decolonizing Network for co-hosting this event. We would also like to thank the team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event happen, including Asha Ali, Malcolm Richards, Katie Nathaniel, Sarah Wood, Sarah Roberts, Nadia Khalaf, and Sajjad Rizvi. Many thanks also to our audience who are joining us from around the world via Zoom and YouTube. And of course, we're grateful for our speakers, Professor Pappe and Professor Spivak, for joining us. And finally, thanks to my co-moderator, Dr. Nandini Chatterjee, who will now introduce herself and share the ground rules for the event.
Thank you very much, Hashem. My name is Nandini Chatterjee. I am Professor of South Asian History at the University of Exeter and the enthusiastic director of the very nebulous Exeter South Asia Center. It's my great pleasure, and I'm star-struck, so if I actually stumble over my words, do forgive me. But it's my job to read you the rule book. So those are, and these are so that the conversation is most enjoyable. For those of us, those of you who are with us on Zoom, Please keep your microphones muted during the event. Cameras may be on or off, of course, as you wish. Comments and questions are invited through the chat functions on Zoom and YouTube and via the hashtag Spivak Pappe 2022. These will be collated by our team and moderated by myself and Hashem. Please do make sure you communicate with kindness and respect as you would in person. This continues to be a difficult time marked by anxiety and loss, and how we speak, of course, matters now as in every other time. Please note that the event will be recorded. You're welcome to change your name if you wish to remain anonymous. During question and answer, Hashem and I will use screen names to identify the speakers. Handing back now to Katie.
Great. I think we can go straight to the introductions and then begin the conversation. So Nandini, I think it falls to you to introduce Ilan for us, please.
Thank you, Katie. That's a great honor to do so. The first book I ever read on Palestine was by Professor Pappe, and without him knowing, of course, he's inspired me greatly, not least over the last 1 year when these conversation series have actually made academic life so much more worthwhile for me. Thank you, Professor Pappe. Professor Pappe is Professor of History and Director of the European Center for Palestine Studies, University of Exeter. He's an expatriate Israeli historian and socialist activist. He's one of the new historians who, since the release of pertinent British and Israeli government documents in the early 1980s, have been rewriting the history of Israel's creation in 1948. Professor Pappe's research contextualizes the history of Palestine into a larger global context of settler colonialism, which has been so useful to so many of us intellectually, and he challenges the dominant Israeli narrative. In addition to his work with ECPS, he chaired the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestine Studies in Haifa and is a founder member of the new movement, the One Democratic State Initiative. He's the author of the best-selling A History of Modern Palestine, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Israel-Palestine Question, which was the first book I had read, The Forgotten Palestinians, A History of Palestinians in Israel, and The Idea of Israel, A History of Power and Knowledge. Professor Pappe has also written 2 books with Noam Chomsky, Gaza in Crisis and On Palestine. Pappe's 2016 book, The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories, received the Palestine Book Award. Thank you so much, Professor Pappe, for being in this conversation. Passing to Hashem.
Thanks so much, Nandini. And I have the honor to introduce Professor Spivak. I read the Professor Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, in my second year of undergraduate studies. And I remember at the time struggling with it, as the best texts make you do. And I only understood at the time that no, the subaltern perhaps cannot speak, but I keep returning to it repeatedly in my work. So we're very honored that you're here. So in her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, Professor Gayatri Spivak speaks of a subject of the West, or the West as subject. Not only is this subject both critical and uncritical, involved in the production of the other, but it also destroys, effaces, and obliterates the pathways with which the colonial subaltern subject could invest its itinerary. Thus, this West as subject as West, which many still try to recalibrate as a post-representationalist subject with no geopolitical determination, is world-destroying. Through both unrelentless epistemic and material violence that relies on colonial capitalist modes of accumulation, the subject as world continues to obliterate worlds in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Turtle Island, South Africa, Chile, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And as scholars, students, and activists, we remain concerned with the problematic that Spivak introduced to us almost 30 years ago. In the midst of this world-destroying violence and the continuous unfolding of embodied and articulated worlds of resistance, protest, and insurgency against and beyond it, can the subaltern speak? How do we speak of a subject that we know is insurgent without freezing it into an object of investigation or a model for imitation? I'm thinking here of the many anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-patriarchal traditions of resistance that many of us think and work with and through, not only to name this violence as it is, as world-destroying, but also to enhance worlds that are already in the making. I'm thinking here of the Palestinian Unity Uprising from last May, of the movement for Black Lives, of the farmers' strikes in India, of the revolutions of the Arab Spring, and many other movements around the world. Professor Spivak's own work pays attention to both the complex world-destroying mechanisms of what Ariella Azoulay has called the relentless, unstoppable imperial violence, and the unfolding and often unintelligible world-making capacities of the subalterns. In her activist work in rural education, ecological agriculture, and subaltern languages, she emphasizes the bridging of theory and practice. She has also been an avid supporter of the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. In both her theory and practice, she has had unparalleled influence on third world feminism, continental feminist theory, Marxist theory, and the philosophy of alterity. Her work has attracted a wide-ranging audience of scholars and activists around the world. She challenges us to think the world more radically. And it's in the spirit of this continuous search for radical alterity that we are honored to host university professor in the humanities at Columbia University, Professor Gayatri Charavorty Spivak. Professor Spivak, I hand the floor to you. Thank you for being here.
Now, I had thought, thank you very much for those extremely kind words. One of the things that I hope I will speak of is that Can the Subaltern Speak was a beginning. It's not something that represents me now. It was a beginning. But I thought that Ilan would start with questions.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, so I hand it over.
And we'll get to the subaltern, of course. That's right, Gayatri, you're right. This is the kind of things that we would like to do. So again, thank you everyone for making the effort that making this event possible. Particular thanks to Gayatri for her willingness just an hour or two before she leaves us to an airport. I know the pressure of traveling, and I really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much for your time in the midst of your very hectic schedule. We began talking with you about this conversation actually when you were in the rural areas in India, and now you are on the brink of beginning a tour of lectures and meetings that will take you to the Gulf, Africa, and beyond. So my first question is, just very shortly, if you can tell us a little bit of what you have been engaged with in India in these last few months.
I actually do not have much all India involvement beyond signing petitions, showing solidarity, and, movement connections. My work is teaching, as you know, yes, and training for the development of a pedagogy that will, in fact, develop the intuitions of democracy in the children of the largest sector of the electorate. Mm-hmm. The outcasts and tribals, they don't call themselves Dalits. That's a more southern Indian. Now the name is being picked up because politicians are using them. But I can get into that later, but we don't have that much time. That's what I do. I have 4 elementary schools for the last 36 years. I also work on the development of ecological agriculture, as was mentioned. I work with girls and boys, women and men, from a gender-sensitive practice. Hey, Surya, if you can, do you want to put up that mugshot? A gender-sensitive practice. I've also been asked to work with the Ministry of Education recently in West Bengal, which is my home state. But there I'm feeling my ropes. Now, I'm, of course, an Indian citizen. I have a 60-year-old green card in the United States, although I've had thousands of students in the United States to whom I have, in fact, this mugshot of some of my teachers, why the guy on the left in the middle has this very peculiar I think that picture was taken, that picture was taken because he was wanting to have a job or something like that. I had to have this mugshot because things were being said about my schools which had nothing to do with anything. I work with these people all the time. I talked to them, I think, day before yesterday. And the second guy, the bald guy, the second guy from the left in the middle thing, Nimai, is illiterate but incredibly intelligent. His mind has not been ruined by bad education. The other one on his side, Ujjwal Lohar, he is genuinely my right hand. There's Dhananjay, and the woman on top on the right hand side, these people teach me, right? She's the one who taught me, and this is extremely important, how to actually urinate in a sari, sitting down like a tent, so nobody actually knows. Because, of course, this is an incredibly gender divided thing. If anybody works in the rural areas, they know. And men actually laugh at the women because they can go so easily. Do you see the back of the cow on the second one? That's the guy who's become so addicted, because that's what I do, Ilan. I try to make people obsessed with things rather than tell them do this. I never touched ecological agriculture. I said to them, I'll tell you what it does to you, all these artificial things, but what they do to you. But I'll certainly not touch rice. But then there came a moment when this guy, Shonot, he was like totally obsessed. He said, Didi, I'm going to touch rice. And now he's so obsessed that he forgets that he's an outcast and an untouchable and all that stuff, which still works in the village areas, right? And he actually talks to caste Hindu folks, television folks, saying to them what he knows and why there should be and why the television lies. And they look at him and they think, see, this is a subaltern bringing himself to crisis. They look at him and they think, how the hell does he talk like this to me? And they're so stunned that they let it pass. He's one of the most wonderful people I've ever seen. And the one on the right-hand side with the dot, Kakuli, she's never been on a train, but she's fantastic in algebra. She can do up to the 63rd space in the square root of 2, right? Square root of minus 2, right? Surya?
Square root of 2.
The square root of 2. She can do up to 60, because I'm bad in math. She can do up to 63rd place with just paper and pencil. She's that good. So I just wanted to show you the people with whom I work. This is not all India. This is just a little live focus, on these people. It's just teaching same standards as Columbia. Surya, do you have the picture of the Columbia students?
Yeah, it'll take me a moment to find.
Okay, good. So therefore, that I'm feeling my ropes with the Ministry of Education, because I'm a Rosa Luxemburg style social democrat. If the state calls me, I will go. It's both medicine and poison, as I've said a million times. I've been involved on the lower levels with the state for a very long time, but now this is the ministry. So there I'm really finding out, learning how I can, in fact, work with a state like West Bengal.
Fantastic! Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And now we have the other image.
Yes, this is my Surya is in it. In fact, by the way, Surya has sold a book on the Black Enlightenment to Duke. I forgot to mention that. So you'll read his big book soon. But at any rate, these are, so I'm close to them as well. And so that kind of, biculturalism, elite and subaltern, this has been so instructive for me that, there was my mugshot of the others, and here are they, except on the right-hand side in front is Latif Rahman from Kwara State University in Nigeria, who was coming to say goodbye to me. He was my intern that year. And I said, Latif, sit down. So he actually sat down. He's not part of the class, but he's part of the Nigeria project. So there they are. Okay, that's it.
That's it. So is he in the picture? So this is a great moment. I mean, it's to move to my next kind of query or question. So there is this, you're theoretical, if you want, writing about education, and then now you have this very practical, for many years now, practical experience in educating. And I wonder whether the kind of things that you're doing there in the schools, is it associated with what you might refer to in one of your articles as a holistic education, Marx's idea of educating for citizenship? Can you elaborate a little bit on this, and how does it differ from concepts such as unlearning? Because you probably have a daily challenges when you educate the educator, so to speak. And where do we carry out this kind of education? You just mentioned that part of what you do, you have to work within the national educational system, which is a model you can follow in many other countries, but not in authoritarian regimes or in settler colonial regimes like Israel, where probably we need to seek parallel, alternative, maybe even at time clandestine way of educating the educators. Whichever way we choose, it seems you are charting for us an activist path that might help us to go beyond academic conversation on humanities, in our ivory tower. Am I reading too much into the concept of holistic education? And how global or local, your experience there can be for other, for people like us who want to go into education in a very similar way in other parts of the world?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. See, when I was using the word holistic, which is a little touchy-feely for me, okay, because I started teaching in 1965 when in the United States, when, you just had to be like, well, I can't even go into it now, but the 60s in the United States. 1965, I started teaching as a tenure-track assistant prof, a long time ago. So I've had it really coming out of my ears. So holistic, by that, what I actually meant was, no class apartheid in education, so that it goes from subaltern to elite in a certain way, so that people really don't know anything about the bottom layer. People who write about, they make generalizations, but of course they've never actually experienced what the so-called bottom layer is like. But I do not work within the national education system, Ilan.
Oh, okay.
I teach the national curriculum so that they can mainstream, they can enter the mainstream if necessary. I teach them rather than some kind of functional literacy, etc., etc. I do not go for those things. It is possible to teach the telephone directory so that your mind is rearranged, etc., etc. So I teach the national curriculum. But the situation of the subaltern groups on the fringes of history are not generalizable. Every subaltern situation calls for its own tactic, strategy, policy, etc. As for unlearning, it is the privileged unlearning their privilege is what I did not like. I think that is very narcissistic. I think it is better to use the privilege for subalternist intervention, although not as a sustained top-down policy. Unlearning false information in textbooks is absolutely essential. So one must see what the form of appearance of the unlearning is. If we are just focused on unlearning our own privilege, first of all, it never happens. And second of all, it's that kind of narcissistic self-involvement, which you see all the time in how sort of bourgeois ideologues talk about themselves non-stop, as if they're the example of the radicalist stuff. And the way they ask questions, it's all me, 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 me. That unlearning of my privilege I find very boring, but I think privilege should be used, although not in a sustained way. But the other stuff, unlearning false information in textbooks, absolutely essential. We do it all the time. I'm also deeply troubled about the situation of the humanities in the United States. My salaried place of work, the idea that, and I'm actually quoting like, I won't say whom, I won't say what, that Colombia should not be a communist hub. I'm quoting administration, that communist hub, that it should be run like a corporation. I quote, it should be run like a bank. I quote. So these things, after all, are not something that you can forget only focusing on the problems of the subaltern. And the Colombia stuff can be generalized, because today, whereas the subaltern cannot be generalized. I was talking in Dakar yesterday about something I learned from Western Australia. And I said to them, look, these folks are, of course, a minority group within a settler colony. But what they taught me can actually have a much broader range. So focusing and working with the subaltern, who are on the fringes of history, Gramsci, there you can't, one methodology is not going to travel to another one. That is subalternity, that it's not generalizable. Anyway, I should carry on. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. In fact, you answered most of my next question, but maybe just we may add one sentence or two, and we'll talk about the university as a corporation. I think this is something people like myself and you, who have been for many, many years in Western academic institution, probably are totally aware of this, and not just because of what happened last year, but it's kind of a process that has begun many, many years ago. But can we shortly return a little bit to subalternity? As you observed, the subaltern is a term that at times is misused, even abused sometimes. I think in particular, there seems to be a tendency to ignore the underpinning Marxist analysis in your work on the topic. We've probably exhausted to a certain extent the discussion about the validity and usefulness of the term, had it not been for the tragic fact that this century introduced us to many more and new subalterns. My first question in this regard is, and I think you partly answer it, but we can kind of accentuate it a bit, is the definition dynamic enough to include not only the obvious new subalterns, namely the life seekers and refugees of this century, but also the citizens of settler colonial countries, such as the Palestinian minority in Israel, whose citizenry does not immunize them from subalternity. And they're not the only ones, of course. And the following kind of interconnected question is, in your mind, is subalternity still a phenomenological term, unlike class or gender? That all it does is enable us to analyze inhumanity, but not represent its victims, and is even not enough to engage with their predicament. Is this a fair approach to the concept so many years after you introduced it or reintroduced it after the original Gramscian reference to it?
Well, as I said, I do think that, when Hashem wonderfully introduced me, that Can the Subaltern Speak was a beginning. I was having a certain kind of very metropolitan crisis about being taken to be an expert on French deconstruction and this and that. I mean, it was really a bit bogus because one is so de-skilled and one is always obliged to speak about the place of origin, et cetera, that at that point, I should have realized that it was great good fortune that I was being taken as an expert on deconstruction. Forget it. But that was when I wrote two pieces, and the three women's texts and a critique of imperialism and Can the Subaltern Speak. But Can the Subaltern Speak was really a beginning, and then things changed. But I will say that when in a brief answer to Ilan's question, when the rights of citizenship cannot be accessed, as in the case of Palestine, that is certainly subalternity. We are doing it at home, and we are doing it in India, taking away citizenship through various modes from Muslims who have lived there forever, but of course they do not have the papers. I mean, how would they to prove it? I mean, that is subalternity, rights of citizenship. And when our Palestinian colleagues, that's a class thing, suffer absolute discrimination in international professional travel. I mean, this has happened so many times, it's not even worth talking about. That is subalternization. Mm-hmm. See, that's, I mean, Antigone the princess was subalternized. And subalternity and subalternization are two different kinds of things, again, asking for different kinds of strategies. The subaltern is certainly and also racialized and gendered. We certainly need to engage with them, not just to learn from them how to teach, but also to consolidate infrastructure so that someday they can be heard. So this idea, if you just keep it as an idea, and especially if people come forward and say, I'm a subaltern, I can speak, hey, listen, they haven't understood that it's not about self-promotion. Not every kind of suffering or not every kind of location is subalternity as one can use it, because these are people now who vote. This is why I talked about intuitions of democracy, etc. Someone asked me, how can you do it? How can you do it? Can I teach you how to play the piano? You know, you can't, I can't tell you. I'm just failing. I'm learned for 36 years because you don't undo the denial of intellectual labor, which is another condition of subalternity, by just being nice. But what I'm learning is how to learn from failures and not think of them as failures. It's possible to fail in a certain way with the subaltern in a common enterprise, but intellectual labor cannot be taught. So how? That's really one of those impatient elite questions. You know, like you would not ask me to teach you how to sing Rabindra Sangeet in just this one session, would you? And it's certainly more complicated, more difficult than playing the piano or singing Rabindra Sangeet. So therefore, I would say that yes, we have to engage it, but engaging with subalternity is not so easy. And anytime that we want to represent ourselves as subalterns, we should stop immediately. Frederick Douglass did not represent himself as a subaltern. Remember him. He's a fantastic example for me all the time.
Excellent. Let's move a little bit to your engagement with history in, you know, in the widest possible sense of the term. Sajjad, our director, mentioned, and I fully agree with him, that your work helped professional historians like ourselves to see the importance of theory when we are writing our historical work. In your case, I found out actually that you are using history in order to clarify moral philosophical position. You refer to history methodologically in a way that, if I may be bold enough to say, that only obsessive historians like me and my friends can fully appreciate. You are very meticulous in your historical research. And my impression is that any point you want to hammer in comes with historical example, culminating with, I think it's your upcoming work on the most important figures, at least in my pantheon of historians, W.E.B. Du Bois. You called him in one of your lectures, the Du Bois lectures, in fact, the major historian sociologist of the 20th century, with which I fully agree. Du Bois allows us to build a new genealogy of racism, including what you called in your book an aesthetic education in the era of globalization. You called it low-grade racism. Why do you attach so much importance to concretizing your theoretical arguments with historical examples? Is it a method of widening your readership? Is it a way of maintaining relevance to reality beyond discursive reality? Or is it something different altogether?
Now, let me say that I have never asked myself, why do I always concretize the theoretical? I'm glad you pointed it out, and yes, I do. I've never thought to justify this. Maybe it's the literary impulse to turn thinking into learning. I wish I had a couple of hours that would talk about this incredibly hard thing. The imaginative activism of entering another space, effacing oneself as far as possible. For example, the last few days in Dakar, before that, the last few days in Rabat at the new Mohammed VI Polytechnic University, you know, entering into that space effacing oneself as much as possible. It's not possible, of course, and I also have, having soldiered all my life, I have a strong self-concept so that it begins to interfere, or that Gayatri, stop it, it's not about you. It's a resistance. Yeah, okay, so the imaginative activism of entering another space, effacing oneself as far as possible, this comes out in interaction with such historian friends as, and there are others, I'm just mentioning some very important ones, alphabetically, Charles Armstrong, Mamadou Diouf, Romila Thapar, Hari Vasudevan. I've never thought of the pre-colonial as a comfort zone, but that's because, I come from this caste Hindu background. In fact, Can the Subaltern Speak is not post-colonial. It's a very strong critique of the pre-colonial. Shumit Sarkar noticed that, and for this, I'm very grateful to him. I've taught myself to look for the universalizable there in the pre-colonial. I certainly have. For the universalizable there without universalizing in the pre-colonial, and to think secularism outside of the colonial story. And I'm still trying to do that. I'm myself an atheist, but that's not the point. It's not be like me and you'll be a good secularist. So the pre-colonial, and to think secularism outside of the colonial story. So I would say that this involvement with history, I'm just, I don't know, I'm very glad you pointed it out, and I will think about it, because it just seems to me that history and its truth claims and its verifiability has to run hand in hand with the fact that in the literary, in a very difficult way, we learn from the unverifiable. And this is something that helps in the subaltern work, the unverifiable, because of course Gramsci's main point that they do not have access to historiography, which is the difference from the South Asian subaltern studies group.
Indeed, and if I just expand on it a little, a different aspect, and you already mentioned it, and I feel for it because I have a similar, it's not a predicament, but kind of engagement, both as an activist and as a professional historian. It's kind of ambivalent, natural, I think, relationship with history. On the one hand, history is a reservoir of structures that can re-emerge or be called upon by contemporary societies. Thus, I noticed when you were engaged in radiating globality, you and your colleagues noticed the resurgence of pre-colonial structures you refer to as, and I have the quote here, as the negative outcome of the failure of liberation. But then when you discuss secularism, as you just mentioned, and gender in traditional, for absence of a better term, societies, while berating what you called ready-fix feminism, for instance, or when you mentioned the Ottoman Empire, which you beautifully described as the carrier of an attitude of conflictual coexistence towards religious difference, unquote, you seem to have much more respect for the pre-colonial realities and even attitudes. In this respect, I find you are very much, if I'm right, of course, you correct me if I'm wrong there, but if this is a kind of more ambivalent relationship to pre-colonial structures, I think this would be part of the fascinate, or it will correspond very easily with the fascinating contemporary work done today by Arab and North African thinkers who conjure the past as an inspiration for alternative models of liberation that will take them out of what one of them called the long winter of Arab post-coloniality. They dig into the past also in order to liberate themselves from equating universalism with Westernism or Eurocentrism in a search so poetically enunciated by the Tunisian poetess Amina Said when she writes, I issue from my childhood and thus from nowhere else. Is it possible that part of decolonization, and I'm using this very carefully, is also demodernization, if modernization equates, of course, Westernization, or at least a cautious demodernization?
Well, here if we sat down together, as happened yesterday, for example, I gave the inaugural talk for the Biennale, and then at the end I was on a fantastic panel. The others were just extraordinary, and we began to see how much we did agree. So maybe if we sat down together, the agreements would emerge. But by the way, radiating globality is still going on. COVID kind of stopped it. Our next stop is Guatemala, but I can't talk about where the Cold War probably started, the new declassified CIA documents. But as it maybe the what I was saying there was precisely, I was questioning these kinds of ideas of bringing through. Surya, can we see the broken pages of Flora Shaw, please? See, I was talking to them about why this kind of gesture is maybe a gesture that denies complicity, being folded together, and denies this kind of, the long list of, as my phrase now is outside in the funding machine. Because once I began to, those terrible marriages ended after 21 years of my trying to be a good wife. They ended, and I came into thinking again that what I really wanted to be was useful to others, not just be focused on these guys. And so therefore, I began to realize then, serious work, that the left and the right were completely allied, and you cannot do anything without noticing this. I was saying to them yesterday, there is no nationalist shame in acknowledging collaboration with certain areas of colonialism, very class fixed, gender focused. This is a complicated situation. And so I told them, Surya, did you get into can you get to those pages? Yes. I asked them to look at Flora Shaw's book, C.W.E. Du Bois's personal copy, how broken it is in the library. Nobody gives a damn to actually see. And now this book, written by Flora Shaw, who married later Lugard, who was the head of Nigeria, tropical, and she never went to school, old Flora Shaw. And this book came out in 1906, and you see this is Du Bois's personal copy, broken into nothingness. Nobody is looking to preserve these books. An outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan with an account of the modern settlement of northern Nigeria. And I asked them, they didn't even know the name of this book. This is about the fantastic Ifriqiya, Islamic empire in this area. And she certainly was very much for this and against the Europeans, but she had the kind of racism against the Bantu, which generally is still implicit in the Ifriqiya studies, that, and not so strongly, but for her, the Bantu lived in swamps and were cannibals. And I said to them, take a look, this is Du Bois's copy. He certainly knew this book very, very well. And ask yourselves in what way these kinds of implicit attitudes are still ours, so that to an extent, as I say, it came out in 1906. So I'm not completely comfortable with creating, and I even said that, creating alternative histories. Why is that necessary? That's a European fantasy. Europe is also part of our heritage, but a Europe transformed by us. This is what we should investigate, that Europe was not, quote unquote, standing there by itself, although it was trying to. So and in fact, the guy who spoke just after me, Ibrahim Wane, he was so fantastic on this. I mean, he had prepared his paper before I had spoken. He gave such concrete examples of the transformation of Europe through the past centuries. It was just, Skip's idea, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Gates's idea of signifying. This idea is what we should, I think, think about, how we are folded together, how we are part of what we critique, rather than, and that I think actually gives us a much stronger position than the creating of this binary opposition. It can be a comfort zone, for sure it can be a comfort zone, but that the comfort is not the same as being global together. The kinds of attitudes I'm talking about, it's theocracy in India, it's the Silk Road in China, the One Belt, One Road, and those kinds of, and of course, Europe, once again, being interpolated as, you look at Ukraine, interpolated as the source of democratic behavior for everyone via the asylum, and so on. So it seems to me that here we would really have to, you and I, sit down together and ask ourselves, is this indeed what we want to? And that may be because of my historical position. Yeah. I come from one of the worst best traditions of the world. Even the Nazis took it, Aryanism. So therefore, it's hard perhaps for me to step out of it.
Absolutely. There's so many other questions about the left, the university, and so on. But as I promised, we will do the last part of our conversation focusing on Palestine. I know we have such an intelligent and knowledgeable audience. So a lot of the more general theme that I skipped would come out in the questions, I'm sure about it. So let's move to Palestine towards the last part of our conversation before we open it up, and begin with Islamophobia and Palestine. When the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingyas began, as someone who wrote, maybe even coined the term, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, I was horrified by the similarities between the two cases in terms of planning, execution, the making of the refugee, and the international silence, which continues until today, a repeat in many ways of the years 48 to 1950 in Palestine. Is there at the heart of both denial of the Palestinian refugee and ethnic cleansing problem, and the Rohingyas ethnic cleansing, and far worse, probably in some parts, even genocidal policies, do you detect a strong element of Islamophobia compared to the compassion the West is showing, for instance, to the so-called white refugees from the Ukraine, notwithstanding the obvious different historical circumstances of all cases? Is it something that we have to face and calculate when we're trying? And I know how much I heard you speak so passionately about the Rohingya when you felt that other people are not raising the voices about this.
Yes, I want to share with the audience what I shared with you. I'm like a school child, right? I write down like exam questions. So I actually at 3 a.m, I was writing, and I don't think you will be able to read it, but I want to share it nonetheless. Can you see that I was writing all of these answers?
You have a decipherable handwriting. I wish we had more time to.
Okay, and do you know what answer I wrote to this question, Ilan?
No idea.
Yes, Islamophobia. Yeah. That was my answer. It is, all the other answers, some of them I read, they were long. But this one, I don't think it requires a long answer. No, of course, Islamophobia. And as part of a genocidal 86% majority in my country, I have to speak about Islamophobia in a way that carries shame. When the Babri Masjid was destroyed, my mother called me and wept on the phone, saying, "I'm ashamed to be a Hindu." So this kind of thing, the position that one occupies. That's why I say to my students in the villages, "I'm your enemy. I'm your enemy. I'm good, but you must do without me. My parents were good, but thousands of years of destruction are not undone by 2 generations. You must do without me." So to an extent, that the fact of Islamophobia, about which so much can be said. Surya, can I have the picture of the Shahidul Alam's picture of the Rohingyas coming in? See, so much can be said, and the Rohingya situation can be so, let's see. Oh, there they are. You see, look at this picture. They're not going to be, they're sitting in mud there. Those are not the places that they will stay. That's where they've been brought. This idea of homelessness, this idea of statelessness, which is deeply also connected with Islamophobia. This is what is terrifying. I mean, Islamophobia gives a certain kind of ization because there's alternative internationality. This kind of a thing. I mean, it goes back to the suppression of Byzantine. It's got a Byzantium. It's got a very long history, and it gets transformed. I mean, when we talk about the Ottoman, when they began to modernize, there was a genocide. So to that conflictual coexistence disappeared, just as the conflictual coexistence in my neighborhood. I mean, I lived on just where Sayyid Amir Ali Avenue changes into Old Baliganj. And so that conflictual coexistence, which we, and my father is from the upper northeast corner of Bengal, which is now Bangladesh. I mean, they were completely, I mean, my father's father looked like a Muslim, except for his damn sacred thread, you know. So therefore, this whole business of conflictual coexistence, we know it, and it can break down, it can become politicized because religion is such a dangerous thing. So therefore, I mean, that's my childhood experience, that transformation and the killing with machetes, not guns. So therefore, I would say, yes, Islamophobia. It's not something that we can just elaborate on at this point without going into a lot of history. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm totally persuaded that also part of the treatment of the Palestinians, part of the coverage, part of the discourse on the Palestinians in the West, especially in the United Kingdom, is very much marred by Islamophobia. I hope I can squeeze another one or two questions on Palestine as well. We were all shocked, and I know we talked about it, by the Israeli assassination of the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, whom some of us knew very well. Reporting on the Israeli crimes is one mode of resistance in Palestine, but there are many others. So let me, towards the end of our conversation, get us both into travel, Gayatri, and talk about suicide bombers, or any young men and women, sometimes teenagers in Palestine, who use their bodies in the struggle in the most tragic way imaginable. You wrote, and I quote, "Suicidal resistance is a message inscribed in the body when no other means will get through. It is both execution and mourning for both self and other, where you die with me for the same cause, no matter which side you are on." From my own experience, this issue is one of the most challenging concerns when defending publicly the Palestinian anti-colonialist struggle. I fully understand why the Palestinians are using every means in their disposal to stop the destruction of their homeland and their lives. Do you still feel that way about this mode of resistance? Because I know people, when I wrote similar things and you wrote it, people found it unacceptable. How do you feel about this, or your engagement with the modes of resistance that cannot all of them be peaceful against a very violent, intent program of destruction, ethnic cleansing, and at times, as in the Gaza Strip, genocidal?
Of course, it's unacceptable if you're just sitting and being reasonable. We are not talking about reasonableness. We are talking about the limits of reasonableness when there is no response from the other side. When, you know, the evaluation of human worth turns, then, I mean, we should see who and what produces this conviction that, you know, that's the way the subaltern speaks. I mean, that's why the guy burnt himself in Tunis. There was something that could have been, there was a response. He did speak, didn't he? So therefore, was easy. So the thing is that this is, I certainly still think that this is a response in extremis when no response has been forthcoming forever. So therefore, what produces this change which is completely against reason? This is, it's just sitting and saying it's unreasonable. Then you have to ask, who is judging? Because therefore, anybody like me, for example, who gets such a response that there are 114 participants at this Zoom, I'm so fortunate that all, and you, Ilan, have read, you, Hashem, have read, all of this stuff. I get a lot of response. So who am I to say it's unreasonable? Of course, from my little corner, it is unreasonable. But I must, that's the literary, try to efface myself and go to that place. When I wrote that piece, Ilan, I won the Piper Prize given by George Bush for the most absurd academic piece. And I wear it like a crown. It wasn't Chomsky, it wasn't Edward Said, it was me, Gayatri Spivak, because I had tried to understand suicide bombing rather than just dismiss it as unreasonable. So that's what I would say when no response has been forthcoming. I'm still there.
Absolutely. And my final question, because this is something that I know bothers our community of activists and scholars who deal with Palestine in the university. Many of us support the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction, and we include in it the idea of an academic boycott. And of course, the counter argument that even my good friend Noam Chomsky is using is that this is a violation of academic freedom if we include a boycott of academic institutions as part of our wish to show solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. So before we open up, how do you feel about this idea of an attempt, probably by academics who cannot go and join a liberation army, but feel that they are sending a tough message to the Israeli academia that tries all the time to be in contact with them? It's a tough dialogue with them, saying, no, we are not going to have a normal conversation with you because you are complicit in what's happening in your name, or sometimes you are actually collaborating directly with the oppression of the Palestinians.
I would say, since we don't have much time, you cannot buy freedom at any price. And I would also say that when you begin the history of academic freedom with Kant, then you're making a mistake. Look at the academic freedom of the Brahmins.
Right.
Look at the academic freedom of the imperial civil service in China. And so therefore, look at a much broader example of what so-called, how academic freedom is bought, how the academy is put in its place where freedom can be bought at any price. I'm with you there. Develop some rage. You undo the academy. When Du Bois saw in 1899 that Sam Holt's knuckles were going to be sold, he stopped and he said, I cannot teach the way I've been teaching. My teaching is now going to be called propaganda. He says this. And then the Gramsci says, the new intellectual must be a permanent persuader. So they are already saying, forget academic freedom. And it is a position against the state of Israel and its policies and practices. This is so obvious. It is not against a religion or race. This is something that after all, if you're talking about reasonableness, be reasonable. It's against the policy of a state. It's got nothing to do with, I'd be damned if I'm called an anti-Semite. It's absolutely incorrect to call it anti-Semitic. It's against a state. So these obvious answers that you would also give.
Yes. But we need to hear it. We need
to say it, and we need to make it heard.
Absolutely. And in my case, I'm a self-hating Jew, which is an incurable disease, my doctor told me.
Yes, and I'm
not hating myself.
Hey, I'm a self-hating Hindu. I'm asked by Bengali diasporics in New Jersey, why don't you behave like an immigrant? And I say to them, smiling, I'm not an immigrant. That's why.
Well, we live in a world that people who support human rights, the civil rights, are called radical and extreme, and people who are violating it are called moderate.
There you are.
I think we, Katie, I'm always giving it up to you because I don't remember the order. I'm sorry. I was so excited about this conversation. I really forgot it wasn't just Gayatri and me in the room. I forgot that we have audience as well. So we're back to the setting. And thank you for this part. And let's move and hear our audience. We have a bit of time with them. Thank you.
Great. I think this is up to Hashem and Nandini to be moderating and sharing with you. Thank you.
Perfect, Katie. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Gayatri Spivak, for the amazing conversation, Professor Pappe. So just, I'm going to use my privilege as a moderator to ask the first question, and then we're going to have some questions from the audience. So just thinking about the idea of epistemic violence, and my question is, to both Professor Pappe and Professor Spivak. So in the context of Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine, I think the Israeli episteme relies on a general violence with a mandate to dispossess and erase. So it requires this general violence as its condition of possibility, the erasure of Palestinian geography, the erasure of time, erasure of bodies, erasure of archives. And Professor Pappe, your work on archives in the context of the Israeli Settler Colonial Academy names and challenges these modes of epistemic violence and happens against the backdrop of the continuous theft of Palestinian culture and archives. So I would love to hear both of your thoughts on how to understand this epistemic violence in this contemporary juncture in Palestine and beyond. And, another difficult question, how to counter it. Thank you.
Gayatri, please start and I will add it.
Yes, you're sure. Well, you know what I'll do, what you noticed, I'll concretize. You see, I'm because in fact, that kind of practice norms the theory. It shows where the theory was. I mean, if we had talked about the thing about the pandemic, I would have said something because I wrote the answers after all. I would have said that the Kantian sublime failed with the pandemic. Is it Trump versus Kant? The dynamic and mathematical sublime, which is the pandemic, did not call forth the moral will in human beings. So this is perhaps why I concretize theory. I asked you, to see how concretization norms theory. So the idea of the sublime was rocked on its feet. So to an extent, I would say that this epistemic violence, also concretizing, I would say that the way I see it in my teaching today, rather than just simply say the colonizers epistemically violated us, which in the intervening years, I have seen this idea of collaboration, the fantastic collaboration in my own state, because they came in through Bengal, right? Which I looked at the textbooks that they're writing for, and I hope Anirban Bhattaji is in the audience because he works with me in the villages. I hope he is, because we saw, and Surya also saw, we were looking at the children's textbooks issued by the Board of Education. And this movement, which was collaborative against certain kinds of caste practices, etc., my college, Henry Vivian de Rosio, a white Eurasian who actually declared that he was Indian. It wasn't easy. This is now being represented as extremism, anti-Hindu extremism. I can show you the book. I can't actually have locked up the case, but it is in my case. So to an extent, this is also epistemic violence. And in what happens at Columbia is, because of the fact that we no longer emphasize the humanities are trivialized, no one can read. They can summarize, they can relate to history, they can focus on their own idea and say, this is the idea that what I'm reading is going to be an example of. And they begin with their own little black box. They never go outside of it. This is epistemic violence. That is to say, the withdrawal of the possibility of reading. So therefore, I would say that one notices epistemic violence in the history of the present, not just by pointing a finger and saying, hey, they epistemically violated us, as if there was no power play before. Just 1 second. Alors oui, Oui, bonjour, mais je suis toujours dans l'interview, ok? Ça va, je crois que ça va arrêter pendant, dans 10 minutes ou quelque chose comme ça. Ok, allez, au revoir. You see, they want to take me to the airport. Therefore, I would say that the epistemic violation, when you look at it before, you can't really tell how, you can't measure epistemic violence because we are, in fact, enabled and violated, strong children of rape. And so, therefore, it is rather than make it a finger-pointing exercise, we should see how globally, in fact, education always comes with a certain degree of violence. It's luckily the future anterior, that is to say, whatever you plan, it's going to make it something else. It's not going to be what you planned. That protects us from just violating. But education violates. It's therefore, I say it dehumanizes humanities education because the human is fear, greed, violence. So therefore, it's a complicated question, Hashim, but I tried to be as honest as possible through my own experience. It's not a diagnosis, it's ourselves. So
I think we'll move to so that one or two more person can join us.
Sure. So we have a question from Muhammad Bari, with whom I would like to combine a question of my own, if I may, in requesting you, Professor Spivak, to compare a bit more explicitly between the conditions in Israel and India. So Muhammad Bari asks, India under Modi seems to be following Israel's strategy vis-a-vis Muslims, and in many Western countries, politicians are using Islamophobia to win votes. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, and what's your advice? To which I have a more pointed question to add on, which is about your commitment to BDS. So a question that does come up several times and has been asked of Professor Partha Chatterjee, for example, is why don't other countries and academics therein deserve similar boycotts? For example, why do we exempt India from such a boycott? And how would you guide us to think about it?
Okay, well, these are very powerful questions. I'm not a boycott politics person. I've been pushed into this because there is a movement and I joined. It makes me go against my own ethical commitments. See, I'm not a boycott person. I'm a do-it person, okay? I couldn't do anything in Israel, and there was the movement. I don't generally judge reasonableness. I do lots of unreasonable things. I've earned the right. The imagination is neither rational nor irrational, and I'm sold to the imagination. I've earned the right with living the way I do, completely alone. I've supported myself since I was 17 so that I could be unreasonable if I wanted to. So I would say to Partha, as I have, you be reasonable. There are many things I do in terms of ethical practice which you can't say is reasonable. And if they boycotted India, I couldn't boycott India because I'm Indian. But on the other hand, I would say that I've been working against Islamophobia as strongly as I can in an activist sphere, which is outside of the academy, also in the academy, of course, I write about it, I join movements, etc. But with spinal stenosis, I can no longer march, but nonetheless, of course, but I do work against it actively in terms of, because in the subaltern sphere, Nandini, I don't think anybody is going to understand what I'm going to say, but I don't have the, as you saw, I don't have the time to explain, perhaps in another conversation later. One of the, in my neck of the woods, it's in those villages in Bengal, mostly subaltern Islam is Shia. And, Muharram, the Hindus and the Muslims, they dance together in the Tajia. They don't know anything about syncretism. In the Durga Puja, the person who keeps the accounts because he's good in math, his name is Gafur. He's obviously a Muslim. I mean, this is the big Hindu holiday, right? So this exists. But that guy, Shanot, whom you saw, he says to me one day, Didi, Mokkai bole birat boro koshti pathor ache. Mokkai naki Shiv badha achen. Okay, so Shiva, because the Kaaba, because it's black, that Shiva is tied inside it. Okay, he's asking me. Now the thing is that positive or negative? I don't know. So to an extent, where I work, Islamophobia is very gender-based also. So that kind of subaltern Islamophobia, which is huge, it can be used by the government. It's inchoate. So therefore, I would say, if anybody asks me to justify myself, I would say, well, if India is boycotted, I would understand. I wouldn't suffer so much because I live in the US. But on the other hand, I would understand. We have bought that. So, but I'm not going to sit down and make a list and boycott every place that has that kind of low-grade Islamophobia is everywhere. The idea that Islam is a religion of terror, which is a bogus idea. Every religion for me is and become of terror because of the nature of the religious. But that kind of idea, if you sit down and make a list, so you'd be left alone boycotting everything. I'm not with Karatani. My real policy is to go towards something, which is why I'm now getting deeply criticized by my left friends in West Bengal. Oh, she's agreed with this TMC government to be on their committee. It's a nonsense. I haven't agreed to anything. I can join anything because I don't join anything. But so therefore, I would say that kind of reasonable sitting down in judgment, let's boycott every space. I'm not into it. This thing exists. I was asked early, I joined. It's against my ethical commitments, but that's what Israel has done to me, taken away the possibility of behaving according to my ethical commitments. I'm enraged. So that's an emotion. That's so that just remember that those of us who are given over to, Surya, show that afro. You see this guy, what's his name again? Kanakasi. He's Senegalese. So he made this afro. Okay, United States of Africa. He was arrested. He was there yesterday. So he was arrested in Paris. And so I said, tell the police it's art. And so art got him out. Okay, but then after he got out, I said, remember, all money is fiction. I'm not talking about all the theories about money, which is not quite the linguistic system, etc. I know those. But fiction is a different kind of word. All money is fiction. The world is supported by fiction. The world goes around supported by fiction. So therefore, to deny the fact that the imagination does not always work reasonably and does not always work unreasonably, it's in some other place. It's an active place. It is to deny that when you're asked to be reasonable and just make your lists as to how many places you will boycott. I think that's an idea of people, armchair politics. I think I should probably go, Ilan, shouldn't I? What do you think?
No, do you have another 10 minutes or you don't?
I don't really know. It's 11:20 a.m. Actually, I said 11:30. I said 11:30.
That's right. Can you stay with us another 10 minutes?
Okay, but then I really have to go.
No, we'll sharp on the 30. We'll make sure you don't miss your plan, and we have to bring you back. It's so clear to me. I just want to add something about this. We talk about this, let the subaltern speak, and so on. The idea of an academic boycott came as a call from the Palestinian civil society. The reason they feel so strongly about the academic representation of Palestine, because they analyze. It was
Omar Baruti, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah. Well, he was the spokesperson for 150 NGOs in the Palestinian civil society who feel that the Western academic analysis on Palestine relies on the Israeli production of knowledge. And that production of knowledge,
yes,
it creates a shield of immunity that prevents governments, an important section in the Western society, to take action against Israel. So this is not a matter of shall we boycott others. This is a request from the oppressed to use that kind of weapon that we can use. And if another community would say to us, you know, we are particularly worried about the production of academic knowledge on our case study, we would consider it as well. So it's not just a boycott for the sake of boycott. This is something existential from the perspective of the Palestinian civil society that they feel is no less destructive than F-16 tanks and bombardment from the air that endangers the existence of Palestine. Yeah, we have 8 minutes, so another question, and we'll see how long Gayatri gets to answer that, and we make sure that you'll get to the plane. If we yes. need to, we'll talk to the captain.
Right. You make sure.
We'll try. Okay, so we have 8 minutes, and we have a great question from Yasmin, who said, I love the idea of struggling with the pedagogical humility of effacing ourselves and this never being entirely possible. I would like to hear more about what turning thinking into learning looks and feels like in relationships of teaching and learning.
Well, I don't, as I said before, this is a serious and sincere question, but in order to see that, you know, you will really have to be working together rather than me talking about it. The turning thinking into learning, that's the most mysterious moment of sometimes fear. I can only say that I have written something about my teacher, Tarak Natshin, and you know, this is early instruction, and that has not been published yet because they actually sold his, they didn't tell me, but they sold his collection of essays to another publisher. And so I actually wrote it. I'm glad they didn't tell me. I'll put it somewhere. But in that essay, I have, in fact, written about how Tarak Babu actually made us think about this, about, you know, because we were the first post-colonial generation, right? So what he really taught us was to say yes to the enemy, because that is the greatest going out of yourself that you can do. And this is, although he was himself very equal to both the women and the men in the classes, he was not like a, you know, articulate feminist or anything, but within feminism, I certainly found this to be a very useful thing, what we have to collaborate with. But how that thinking turns into learning, I will say this. I've been working with the unsystematized mother tongues of Africa now for over 10 years, Nigeria-based. And one of the things that I have thought of without golden aging, okay, because it's contaminated, but nonetheless, the idea we must be able to think is that when it is, I don't call them orality, I call it namic, because it's written in the memory. And as it were, the digital has finally caught up with it. And so in that situation, before that, we valued more primitive instruments like writing, alphabet, this, that. So in that situation, what they developed, you know, with the namic languages was practice-based and not theoretical production-based. We decided to call it negatively. But today, from this end, what I feel after all these years of work, and the interest of linguists like Claire Bowen or Stephen Bird, etc., that how are these languages taught without those more primitive instruments like the alphabet, etc.? How are they taught? What we see is that that was perhaps a way of regulating the Anthropocene and by making it practice-based rather than theoretical production-based. There's a lot of nonsense in these remarks I'm making, also Plato, amnesia, etc. But it's a thought. And it seems to me that if we can think this counterintuitive thought, maybe if this practice of learning rather than the production of knowledge, the objectivity of an object of knowledge, perhaps something can happen. But it's easy to say this. Okay, remember that I'm working with these people. And so they are themselves not particularly within this way of thinking. So, it's an effort. I don't write about these things because I'm not an expert. It's a practice of learning. So therefore, I'm giving you an answer. But these descriptive answers in the long run are useless because you can write it down. Spivak said, and everything will be undermined. Everything I'm trying to do, all the mistakes will be undermined. Let me just say, I have 4 minutes, Katie. I just want to say that I don't want to stop without saying that to everyone, that outside of my window is the Middle Passage, the North Atlantic. I can see Gorée Island from my window, which is where they left from, one of the places they left from. And I will also say that something that I didn't notice, which Maurice Condé made me notice, was when I wrote that 3 Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, a post-colonial feminist analysis for which I lost some friendships. I forgot to planter and therefore must have had thousands of slaves, and thus I separated in that essay slavery from post-colonial studies. And since that essay, for God knows what reason, still has effect. I mean, I look at how many times it's downloaded. That separation, I was not able to undo. And so I wanted to say that in this conversation so that we didn't not notice that this is a case within the study of post-coloniality.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. I'm so sorry that we're not able to include all the other questions. I will let Katie just to say the final thank you and wish you a bon voyage. And I do hope that we will be able to continue the conversation in whatever format. And we would love even to have a photocopy of the answers, because not all the questions were there if you have the time later on. Katie, please, I leave you with the final words.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it right over to Hashem, who I know has prepared something to close us out. Thank you.
I'm cognizant of time, so I just want to say thank you so very much, Professor Gayatri Spivak, for being with us today and for inspiring us. And I hope all the audience keep the reflections and thoughts from this lecture with them in organizing and thinking and educating and protesting. And I can say on behalf of the audience that, we're praying for you to make it to your flight. So I hope you have a safe flight. And thank you so much again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And
goodbye.
Good trip.
Thank you, everyone. Safe travels.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. I think
And we're done. Thank you, everyone.
we're done. Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a great day. Thank you, Ilan, as ever.
As ever. See you in the next one with Nadira.
Yep.
Shahu.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. I'm going to stop the live stream and then end the conversation for the meeting.